Nothing gets on this brow that isn't on my list, including that. Machinist's Mate Second Class Trey Bonaventure said it with the clipboard held across his chest like a shield, and he said it loudly enough that the two sailors behind him would be able to repeat it later, which was the entire point of saying it that way. He was 24 years old. He had been standing the watch as petty officer of the watch for 4 hours and 11 minutes, and this was the first watch of his life in which the decisions had been his. The woman on the brow stopped 2 treads below the landing and did not answer immediately. It was 0502 minutes on a fleet pier in the last week of July, and the sky over the water was the color of a nickel. The submarine tender lay starboard, side to, 449 feet of gray steel breathing quietly against her lines, with a fast attack boat nested outboard of her and 3 timber camels holding the holes off the concrete. The pier smelled of diesel, wet rope, and the low iodine smell of harbor water at slack tide. Somewhere aft, a shore power cable hummed. The woman wore a canvas jacket, work trousers, and boots that had been resoled at least once. She carried a plain Seabag over her left shoulder, no name stenciled on it, no unit, no tape, nothing but salt shadow along the bottom seam where a bag sits on wet ground for years. She was 39 years old. Her hair was blonde and pulled back tight, and she had come up the pier on foot from the gate, which nobody did. And she had arrived a day before anybody expected her, which was the only part of the morning she had planned. "Understood," she said. That was all she said. She did not explain herself. She did not reach for a badge or a phone or a set of orders, and she did not step backward either. She simply stood where she was with the bag on her shoulder and waited, which Bonaventure took as defiance because he was 24 and had never learned that patience and defiance look identical from above. Inside the quarterdeck shack, 6 feet behind him, Ensign Priya Naidu had a telephone against her ear and her back to the brow. She was 24 as well. She had been the officer of the deck for 4 hours and 11 minutes, and she was being read a fuel report she had not asked for by a man who would not stop talking. Taped to the inside of the quarterdeck window, at eye level, curling slightly at one corner in the damp, was a single-page diving authorization for the week's hull inspection. It had been taped there on Monday. Nobody had read past the first paragraph. Seaman Kit Fontaine, 20 years old, laughed once. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a young man agreeing with whoever was loudest. "You hear me?" Bonaventure said. "This is a controlled brow. You're not on the list. Neither is your bag." "Understood," the woman said again. Bonaventure put his boot into the Seabag. He did it the way a person kicks a door that is already open. A shove more than a strike, a demonstration for the audience of 2. The bag was resting on the tread beside her, and it went sideways, and then over the outboard rail, and for a half-second, it hung against the gray sky like something thrown from a bridge. 16 feet below, on the number 2 camel, Seaman Apprentice Wesley O'Hara was coiling a line. He was 19. He had been in the fleet for 5 months. He saw a Seabag falling toward the water, and he did what a 19-year-old does when he sees a shipmate's gear going over the side, which is not think. He lunged off the timber with his right arm out, and his boots came off the wet camel, and he went into the black water between the hull and the camel with no sound at all, except the water closing. "Man in the water," Fontaine said. Then he screamed it. "Man in the water!" There are 11 feet of open water between a moored tender's hull and the outboard face of a camel at slack tide. It is the most dangerous 11 feet on any waterfront in the world. It is unlit. It is cold. The hull moves against its lines in a slow, patient, 40,000-ton breath, and a camel is a floating timber, the size of a bus, and when they close on something between them, they do it without hurry and without noise, and no one standing above can see any part of it happen. The woman was already moving. She put the canvas jacket on the deck. She did not throw it. she put it down. And she went over the outboard rail and down the ladder to the camel, with her hand sliding on the rails and her boots never touching a rung. 9 seconds. Ezra Battaglia, 55 years old, civilian pier superintendent, coming up the pier with a thermos in his hand, and 40 minutes of morning left before anyone would need him, stopped walking at the head of the pier and did not take another step for 9 minutes. Because she did not jump. At the edge of the camel, she paused for perhaps a quarter of a second, folded one arm hard across her chest with the hand locked on the opposite shoulder, put her chin down, and stepped off. Feet together. Body vertical. The entry a person makes into water they respect, into water that might have steel or line or a body in it, into water they intend to come back out of. Every man on that brow had watched somebody jump into water before. Not one of them had ever watched somebody enter it. She came up 8 feet outboard, of where O'Hara had gone in, with his collar closed in her right fist and his face out of the water, clear of the crush line, and her voice came up off the surface flat and unhurried and absolutely certain, and it was giving orders. 0502, tug, all stop. Line tender on the camel, now. Somebody put a light on this water and keep it there. Nobody argued. The tug's engines dropped away to nothing within 20 seconds. A battle lantern came over the rail and found her. Bonaventure stood on the brow with the clipboard still across his chest, and the list on that clipboard ran to 2 pages, and her name was on the 2nd page, and he had not turned it. The water was 61 degrees. She had been on the pier for 90 seconds. The recovery took 11 minutes and 31 seconds, and it did not go the way drills go, because drills are performed by people who know they are being watched, and this was performed by a woman who had stopped noticing that anyone was there. The first thing she did not do was try to lift him. There is a powerful instinct. When a man is in the water and there is a solid surface 11 feet away, to get him onto that surface. It is nearly always wrong. A camel rides on the water and rolls with it, and the gap between camel and hull is where the danger lives, and the correct answer is almost always to move away from the ship, not toward it, even if moving away means a longer swim in cold water with a panicking man on your arm. "Wesley," she said. His name was on his coveralls. "Look at me. You're going to breathe. Nothing else is your job." He was fighting her. They always fight. His right hand had gone into the gap between the camel and the hull as he fell, and it was already opening across the knuckles, and the cold had him, and he had swallowed harbor water, and he was 19 years old, and drowning 11 feet from a ship that had 400 people asleep in it. She got behind him, put her forearm across his chest with his back against her, and started swimming aft, on her side, with her free arm away from the ship. 0503, she called. Her free hand came out of the water and flattened once against the camel timber as she passed it. Palm down. 1 beat, the way another person might touch a doorframe on the way through. 40 feet aft to the accommodation ladder. I'm bringing him to the bottom platform. On the pier, Ezra Battaglia was watching her hands. He had been a Master Chief Navy diver for 22 years before he had been a pier superintendent for 11 more, and he had put more people in the water than he could count. And he knew that you learn nothing about a swimmer from watching their face. You learn it from their hands. Her hands never grabbed. Every movement went from one hold to the next. Hold, with nothing wasted in between. And every time she called a time, she touched a fixed point. The timber. The ladder stringer. A cleat. As though she were laying the number down somewhere it could be found later. He had seen that exact habit in exactly one kind of sailor, and there were not many of them, and they didn't carry unmarked Seabags, up controlled brows at 0500. There was a second thing. and it took him longer to name because it was an absence rather than a presence. She had not once looked up at the brow. Most people in the water look up. It is the oldest instinct there is. You find the faces. You check whether help is coming. You make sure somebody is watching. She had 16 feet of gray steel and 11 staring men above her, and she had not raised her eyes to any of it, not at the beginning and not at the end, because she had already decided in the first quarter of a second, on that camel, that nobody up there was part of the plan. Battaglia had known perhaps 9 people in his life who could make that decision that fast. 4 of them were dead. "Son," Battaglia said quietly, to Fontaine, who had come down off the brow and was standing beside him with a battle lantern shaking in both hands. "Whatever else happens today, remember that you saw this." Chief Petty Officer Verna Dubrow arrived at a dead run at 0509, 38 years old, chief of the watch, having come up 2 ladders and 160 feet of passageway in her socks. She reached the rail expecting to take charge of a disaster, and was met instead by a woman in the water 60 feet away, who gave her a task in the tone of a person distributing work. "Chief, backboard at the bottom platform of the accommodation ladder, not the brow." "Ma'am, backboard, bottom platform. He's got a hand injury and cold water in him, and I'm not lifting him over timber." Dubrow went. She would think about it later, in the way that senior enlisted people think about things later, and she would not be able to identify the moment she decided to obey, because there had not been one. There had only been a voice with times in it. At 0511, the woman brought O'Hara to the bottom platform of the accommodation ladder, 40 feet aft of where he had gone in, and safely clear of the gap. She did not climb out first. She stayed in the water beneath him and pushed while 2 seamen pulled, and she kept talking the whole time, and every sentence had a number in it. "His right hand is opened across the knuckles. It's going to bleed a lot, and it's going to look worse than it is. He was under for 11 seconds, maybe 12. He aspirated once that I saw. Water's 61. He's been in it 9 minutes." The corpsman, who had arrived without anybody being sure who called him, wrote all of it down. He wrote the times. He did not ask her who she was, because there was no version of the last 9 minutes in which the question needed answering. At 0513 and 31 seconds, Wesley O'Hara was on a backboard with a blanket over him and an angry gray color in his face, and he was furious. Not frightened. Furious, the way the young get when the world has embarrassed them. And the thing he was furious about was his hands. The woman climbed out last. She stood on the platform in soaked clothes, with harbor water running off her elbows, and 61-degree cold coming up through her. And she gave a verbal report that lasted 19 seconds and contained 6 times. And then she stopped talking. The ambulance took 9 minutes to clear the pier. She watched it go with her arms at her sides. She had been on that pier for 12 minutes. She had not yet told a single person her name. The pier filled up. That is what happens. The event lasts 11 minutes and 31 seconds, and the aftermath lasts all day. And in the aftermath, the pier fills with people who missed it. The duty section coming up from breakfast, the yard workers arriving at 0600, 2 security patrolmen, a chief from weapons, who had heard 3 different versions before he got his boots on. And in a crowd of people who missed it, the story does not belong to whoever was there. It belongs to whoever is holding the log. Trey Bonaventure was holding the log. He wrote his entry at 0530, standing up in front of 4 witnesses, and he said the words aloud as he wrote them, which is how a frightened young man makes a lie sound like procedure. "Unauthorized civilian on the brow," he said, printing carefully. "Refused to depart when directed. Gear went over the side during the exchange. Seamen entered the water attempting recovery of said gear. That's what happened. That's what I saw. It was not a large lie. That was the dangerous part. Nearly every clause was defensible on its own. She had been unauthorized, in the sense that her name was on a page he had not turned. She had not departed. Gear had gone over the side. A seaman had entered the water. The lie lived entirely in the word, during. And in the absence of one word, kicked. And Bonaventure had already stopped being able to see it, because he had said it out loud 4 times in 6 minutes, and a thing you have said 4 times becomes a memory. The nickname started before the ambulance reached the gate. Somebody called her the swimmer. Somebody else, thinking it funnier, called her the yard bird, pier slang for a civilian contractor wandering where they should not be. And that one stuck, the way the meaner one always does. It went up the pier faster than the ambulance had gone down it. Fontaine repeated it once, to a friend, without thinking, and then heard himself, and did not repeat it again. The woman stood at the head of the pier in soaked clothes and wrote things down. She had asked a yard worker for a notepad, which was the first thing she had asked anybody for all morning, and she had asked for it in 3 words. Now she stood with her back against a bollard and wrote steadily for 20 minutes. The times, the hull numbers, the name of the tug, the position of the number 2 camel relative to frame 112, the wind, the tide, who had been standing where. Her wristwatch was turned face inward on her wrist, the way a person wears a watch when they need to read it with a handful of line, and she never once looked at a telephone. People spoke to her. She answered in 3 words or fewer. "You want a blanket, ma'am?" Fontaine asked, at 0600, holding one out, unable to look at her. "No, thank you." "You want to sit down?" "I'm all right." "They're saying—" He stopped. "I know." Bonaventure, meanwhile, had begun to feel the specific and terrible confidence of a man who has committed himself in writing. At 0610, he found Ezra Battaglia at the head of the pier and asked him, in the voice of one professional to another, to have the civilian woman escorted off the installation. Battaglia looked at him for a long moment. He had a face like a piling, weathered to the point where you could not tell what it thought, and he did not answer the question he had been asked. "You signed the read and initial sheet this morning," Battaglia said. Bonaventure blinked. "The what?" "The Brow and Camel bill. Man overboard procedure for a moored unit with camels alongside. Every watchstander signs it at turnover. You initialed it at 0100. Everybody signs that." "Yes," Battaglia said. "That's the problem." He walked away, and Bonaventure stood there with the feeling of having been graded on a test he did not remember sitting. Consider what had actually happened on that pier in the space of 1 hour. A young man had made a mistake, a real one, a bad one, but a mistake, the kind that a chief absorbs, and a sailor learns from, and a career survives. And in the 58 minutes since, he had spent every ounce of energy he had building a case against the only person in the world who had made sure that mistake did not end with a 19-year-old in a body bag. If that makes something turn over in your chest, you already know how this channel works. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay with this one, because the paperwork he is about to file is going to matter far more than anything he said out loud. Paper was where Bonaventure believed he was strong. He was not wrong about that, in a limited way. He was a good administrative sailor. His logs were legible. His turnovers were complete. He had come into a fleet that runs on documents, and he had learned early that the person who fills out the form first is very difficult to catch, and at 0640 on that Tuesday morning, he sat down at the quarterdeck desk and filled out the form first. He did it properly. That was the awful thing about it. He used the correct format. He listed witnesses. He attached the deck log page and a diagram of the brow. Under narrative, he wrote 9 sentences in careful block capitals and every falsehood in those 9 sentences was small. Then he wrote a second document, because he had convinced himself by then that he was the injured party. And in the second document, he recommended that Seaman Apprentice Wesley O'Hara be counseled in writing for unauthorized entry into the water. At 0650, security came for her identification. They were 2 young patrolmen, and they were entirely polite and completely wrong. They asked her to produce identification at the head of the pier in front of 19 people because a report had been made about an unbadged civilian on a controlled brow. She took a common access card out of her breast pocket and held it out, face up, and waited. The handheld reader was down. It had been down since Friday. One of the patrolmen turned the card over, looked at the front of it for perhaps a second and a half, apologized, and handed it back. He did not read the name. Almost nobody ever reads the name. A card is a shape you check for, not a document you study, and the man had 6 hours left on his shift and a reader that would not power up. She put the card back in her pocket. She did not say a single word in protest. 0651, she said, to nobody, and laid her flat hand once on the top of the bollard beside her. Across the water at the hospital, at 0705, a 19-year-old with 11 stitches across the knuckles of his right hand was being told by a well-meaning first class who had read the report on his phone that he would probably be counseled for going into the water after a bag. O'Hara took that in for a while. "Is the lady in trouble too?" he asked. "She's a civilian, shipmate. It's being handled." "She's not a civilian." "How do you figure?" O'Hara looked at the ceiling. He was 19, and cold to the middle of his bones, and full of a certainty he could not defend. "Because she counted," he said. "The whole time." She kept saying the times out loud. Nobody does that. The first class wrote nothing down. And on the quarterdeck, Ensign Priya Naidu signed the deck log, because that is what an officer of the deck does at the end of a watch, and then found that she could not stop reading it. She had been on the telephone. She had seen none of it. She had come out of the shack at the sound of Fontaine screaming and had spent the 11 minutes doing what a very junior officer does in an emergency she has arrived late to, which is to get out of the way of the people who are handling it. She was not proud of that. It was, in fact, the correct thing to have done, and she was not proud of it anyway. Now she read the log entry, and then she read the corpsman's report, which had come back to the quarterdeck at 0631, and she noticed something. The corpsman's report said the man had entered the water at 0502 and had been in the water a total of 9 minutes. The log entry said the seaman had entered the water during the exchange and put the time at 0506. 4 minutes. In a document, 4 minutes is nothing. A rounding error, a busy watch, a young man estimating. In water at 61 degrees, 4 minutes is the difference between a rescue and a recovery, and Naidu had passed the swim qualification course 18 months earlier and had been taught exactly that sentence by an instructor who had made them all repeat it. She did not say anything. Not yet. She was 24. She was 5 months into her first sea tour, and the log had her signature on it now, too. The wall was up. It was signed, and every line of it was in the antagonist's handwriting. Ezra Battaglia went looking, and the thing he went looking for wasn't her name. He had no interest in her name. He had already been told everything he needed by 9 seconds of ladder and a quarter-second pause at the edge of a camel, and a man who has spent 33 years on waterfronts does not need a name to know what he is standing next to. What he wanted was the procedure, because if he was right about her, then there was a document on that ship with something in it, and he wanted to see the document before he opened his mouth. He found the watch binder in the quarterdeck shack at 0710, while Bonaventure was at the coffee urn. The Brow and Camel Man Overboard bill ran 7 pages. It had been in that binder, and in the binder of every moored unit in the region, for 11 years. It opened with a paragraph nobody reads, listing applicability. Then 2 pages of immediate actions, in order, with the first 30 seconds broken out separately and in bold. The first 30 seconds belonged to the person who saw it, and to nobody else. And then a page on the crush hazard between Camel and Hull, and then a page of nothing but times, and then a page on log discipline that required, in plain language, that every action be called aloud and logged at the moment it occurred, so that the record exists even when the people do not. Stapled to the back was the read and initial sheet. 6 columns. Bonaventure's initials sat in the 4th column, dated that morning, timed 0100. Battaglia turned to page 7, which was the signature page. He read it. He stood there a moment with his thumb on the paper. Then he closed the binder, put it back exactly where it had been, and went to find the young man at the coffee urn. "Pull the report," he said. Bonaventure did not look up. "Why would I do that?" "Because I've been doing this since before your father shaved," Battaglia said. "And because if that woman is who I think she is, then the kindest thing that happens to you today is that you walk over there right now and take it back. She's a contractor. Walk away from it, son." "It's my brow," Bonaventure said. "It's my log. It's my watch." Battaglia looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded slowly. The way a man nods at weather he cannot change, and went and got a set of dry coveralls out of the pier shack. He brought them to her at 0725, and he asked her nothing at all. That was the courtesy, and she recognized it as one. He did not ask her name, or her rank, or what she was doing on his pier at 0500 with an unmarked bag. He handed her folded coveralls and a pair of boot socks and stood there, facing the water beside her, while she looked at them. She had been standing for 3 hours. He had noticed that she had not sat down, not once, not on a bollard or a line reel or a step, which is a thing certain people do not do in front of others, and which he had also not done for 33 years. "Thank you," she said. "There's a head at the top of the pier with a lock on it." She nodded. He drank some coffee. The water slapped against the Camel below them, patient, unhurried, 40,000 tons of steel breathing on its lines. "Vance still alive?" Battaglia asked. Her head came around, 1 degree. "He's alive," she said. That was all. That was the entire conversation, and it was the only crack that appeared in the wall all morning, and it was 1 name wide. Understand what the danger actually was, on that pier, that morning. The danger was not cruelty. Trey Bonaventure was not a cruel man. 6 months later, he would be a considerably better sailor than most of the people who told this story afterward. The danger was that he was young and confident and holding a pen, and that in 5 years of naval service, nobody had ever once made him read a thing he had signed. There is a page 7. There has been a page 7 in that binder on every pier in that region for 11 years. You are going to want to know what is on it. And the young man at the coffee urn had initialed the sheet stapled to the back of it at 0100 that morning. Subscribe and stay with this. The next part is the reason there is a page 7 at all. At 0800, she was given a borrowed office at the head of the pier, and she pulled the blinds. And this is where the audience learns who she was. Her name was Delphine Arsenault. She had been born in 1987. She had enlisted in the United States Navy at 18 and had gone to second-class diver school the following year because a recruiter had used the word salvage in front of a girl who had grown up on a river, and she had stayed in the water for the next 21 years. In February of 2015, she was 28 years old, a Navy diver first class, and off duty. It was a different pier, on a different coast, at 11 o'clock at night. She was 300 yards up the pier, walking back to her truck, when she heard the shout. Petty Officer 3rd Class Aurelio Sant was 22. He had gone off a camel in the dark, in the 11 feet between a hull and the timber, and nobody on that quarterdeck had been able to see him from the moment he went in. She got there in 90 seconds. The response took 14 minutes. Not because anyone was lazy, not because anyone was a coward, because the quarterdeck spent the first 12 and a half of those minutes deciding who to call, because there was no bill, because the officer of the deck called the command duty officer, who called the squadron, who called the fire department, who asked whether the fire department had jurisdiction over a pier, while a 22-year-old was in 11 feet of water, 60 feet from 400 sleeping people. Because there wasn't one on that pier whose job the first 30 seconds were, and so the first 30 seconds belonged to nobody, and then so did the next 30, and then the next. She went in without a tender, because there was no one to tend her. She found him at 4 minutes past the 14. It wasn't enough, and it had never been going to be enough, and that is all that will be said about it here, because the details belong to Aurelio Sant and to his mother, and not to anybody telling the story afterward. 14 minutes. She has spent 11 years learning to say that number without changing her voice. Master Chief Navy Diver. Otho Vance ran the recovery. He was 51 then, and he had a face like a closed door. And afterward, he sat with her on a bollard at the head of that pier until the sun came up. He did not tell her it was not her fault, because she knew that already, and it did not help. He did not tell her she had done everything she could, because she had, and that did not help either. What he said was this: "You can't get those minutes back, but you can take them off the next one." She wrote the bill that summer. 7 pages. It took her 4 months, and it was rejected twice. Every single line in it is a thing that nobody did on that pier that night. The first 30 seconds belong to the person who saw it. Move away from the ship, not toward it. Backboard at the bottom platform, never over the timber. Somebody puts a light on the water, and that person does nothing else. And, on page 5, in language that a captain at the region had wanted, removed as unnecessary, and that she had fought to keep. Every action will be called aloud and logged at the moment it occurs, so that the record exists even when the people do not. That is where the 4 count comes from, not from training, not from a school, from a night when there was no record of anything for 14 minutes, and a mother who had to be told a sequence of events that nobody had written down. The region adopted it. The region stapled a red and initial sheet to the back of it. And in the 11 years since, Delphine Arsenault had watched several thousand sailors put their initials in the 4th column, and she estimated that perhaps 200 of them had read it. In 2016, they gave her the Navy and Marine Corps Medal. It was a small room with a folded flag on a stand, and 11 people in it. There was no press. Vance stood at the back with his hands behind him and his cover under his arm, and when the citation was read aloud, he looked at the ceiling for the entire 2nd paragraph. She has never once believed the medal was for saving anybody. That is the only thought she has ever had about it, and she has had it perhaps 400 times, in elevators and on flight lines, and in the 4 seconds before sleep. They gave me a medal for a man I did not bring up. She has never said it aloud to a living soul. She has never taken the medal out of the box. And the reason she wrote 7 pages instead of a letter to a mother is that 7 pages was the only thing she could think of that would go on being true after she stopped. In 2017, the Navy commissioned her as a limited duty officer, lieutenant in 2019, lieutenant commander in 2025, regional supervisor of diving. and page 7 of that 7-page bill is the signature page. Her name has been on the last page of that document, in every watchbinder, on every pier in the region, for 11 years. At 0500 that morning, a copy of a diving authorization carrying that same signature block had been taped to the inside of a quarterdeck window, curling slightly at one corner in the damp 6 feet from a young man's elbow. Trey Bonaventure crossed the line at 0905, and he did it because it felt like the safest available move. That is almost always how the line gets crossed, not with malice, with the arithmetic of a frightened person who has already committed and can now see only one direction that does not involve going backward. He had a report in the system. He had a chief asking questions. He had a pier superintendent looking at him strangely, and a 19-year-old in a hospital and a hole in his own timeline that he could not account for. So he made it official, and he made it permanent. He opened the installation bar notice module on the quarterdeck computer. He walked to the head of the pier and asked the woman for her identification a second time, and this time he took the card and copied the name off it letter by letter into the field. He typed it correctly. He got every letter right. He did not recognize it. That is worth sitting with for a moment. He read her name off a card, and he held that card in his hand for 11 seconds, and he wrote her name into a government system, and the name meant nothing to him at all, because a name only means something when you have read the page it is printed on. She let him take the card. She let him copy it. She said nothing. Then he wrote the sworn statement, and this was the sentence that ended it. He wrote, "Civilians' entry into the water endangered the seamen and delayed the recovery." Everything else he had written that morning was arguable. This was not. This one sentence was contradicted by the corpsman's written times, by the tug's engine log, by the deck log's own entry of the all-stop order, by Ensign Naidu's signature, and by 11 separate witnesses standing on a pier in daylight. It was the first thing he had committed to paper that was not merely wrong, but provably, permanently, documentably false. And he had signed it under oath, and attached it to a report, and pressed the key. Ezra Battaglia came off the pier fast when he saw the screen. "Don't," he said. And Delphine Arsenault put her flat hand on Battaglia's forearm and stopped him where he stood. "Let him finish," she said. Battaglia turned and stared at her. He had 33 years of waterfront in him, and he understood, finally and completely, in that second, not who she was. He had known that since 0502. But what she was doing, and why she had stood in wet clothes for 4 hours without sitting down, and why she had let 2 patrolmen hand her card back unread, and why she had not said one single word all morning that would have ended it. Because a young man who is corrected on Tuesday learns nothing on Tuesday. Because there was a read-in initial sheet with his fresh initials on it, and a document he had never opened, and the only thing in the world that was going to make Trey Bonaventure read page 7 was Trey Bonaventure's own signature on a lie about it. "It's my brow," Bonaventure said, half to her and half to the pier. "My log. My call." "It is," Arsenault said, and she smiled at him. It was the only time she smiled that day. It wasn't cruel, and it wasn't warm, and it did not last a full second. It was the expression of a person watching somebody drive a stake very hard into ground that doesn't belong to them, and being under no obligation to mention it. He handed the clipboard to the messenger, and the ship's general announcing system clicked live. The squadron duty officer never used her name. He had no reason to. He was a lieutenant in a windowless room 2 piers over, working a serious incident report that had come up at 0600, and the report had bounced back at him with a required field unfilled. A diving authority had to review and sign the water entry section before it could go to the Commodore. He looked up who held that billet in the region, saw that the billet holder's own dive authorization had that unit's hull number on it for the week, picked up the telephone, and passed the requirement to the quarterdeck the way requirements are passed 10,000 times a day in the fleet, flat, procedural, and by title. Quarterdeck, squadron. The speaker crackled across the brow and down the pier and out over the water. Serious incident report is holding for a diving authority. Supervisor of diving has the scene. Bonaventure's first reaction was relief. That is the detail that people who were there always mention afterward. His shoulders came down. Somebody senior was coming. Somebody was going to arrive and take this whole thing off a 24-year-old's brow. And he had the paperwork, and the paperwork was complete. 6 feet away, Lieutenant Commander Roscoe Amado, 41 years old, the ship's diving officer, had stepped out of the shack with a cup of coffee in his hand. At the exact moment the speaker went live. He looked at the quarterdeck window. Taped to the inside of the glass, curling slightly at one corner in the damp, was the week's diving authorization. He read the signature block at the bottom of it. Then he read it again. Then he set the coffee down on the log desk without looking at where he was putting it, and turned around and looked down the pier at a woman in borrowed coveralls standing beside a bollard with a borrowed notepad in her hand. "Petty officer," Amado said. "Sir, squadron's sending somebody. I've got the report ready for... Who do you think the supervisor of diving is?" Bonaventure stopped. "Sir, they're sending... Nobody is sending anybody," Amado said. "Nobody has to send anybody. She has been standing on your pier for 4 hours and 11 minutes. There was a silence on that brow that people would describe, years later, in almost identical language, and every one of them would mention the water. Because that is what filled it, the slow, patient sound of harbor water moving against a timber camel 16 feet below, 40,000 tons of steel breathing against its lines, and 11 human beings not saying anything at all. Trey Bonaventure's face moved through 4 things in about 11 seconds, and everyone on that quarterdeck watched it happen. First, confusion, a small frown, the expression of a man who is certain there has been an administrative error. Then disbelief, as his head came around toward the head of the pier, and he looked at the woman in the borrowed coveralls with harbor salt drying in her hair. Then recognition, which arrived not from her face but from the window. He turned and looked at the glass, at the authorization taped inside it, at the signature block, and read a name that he had typed with his own hands into a bar notice field 11 minutes earlier. And then horror, which is a different thing entirely, and which arrived in pieces. The bar notice, the sworn statement, the seaman he had written up, the clipboard with 2 pages on it, the second of which he had never turned. And last, worst, the red and initial sheet stapled to the back of a 7-page bill in the watch binder 18 inches from his hip, initialed by him at 0100 that morning. 4 hours before, he had kicked a Seabag off a brow into 11 feet of the exact water that document exists to describe. He did not speak. There was nothing available to say. Ensign Priya Naidu came out of the quarterdeck shack. She had heard the announcement through the open door, with the corpsman's report still in her hand, and 4 minutes of discrepancy still sitting in her head, and she came out onto the wet brow and squared herself, and brought her hand up and held a salute. No formation, no announcement, no muster of the watch section. Nobody present but 6 people who happened to be standing there, and 1 civilian pier superintendent at the head of the pier with an empty thermos. "Ma'am," Naidu said, "the officer of the deck has an inaccurate log to correct." Delphine Arsenault returned the salute. "Correct it," she said. 0914. And she laid her flat hand once, palm down, on the brow rail. No arrest, no shouting. Nobody was dragged anywhere. Just a young man standing on a brow that had stopped being his, holding a clipboard with her name printed on page 2, which he had still, even then, not turned over. The reckoning took 2.5 hours, and almost none of it was punishment. Naidu corrected the deck log first, with the corpsman's times, initialed and dated, with the original entry struck through by a single line and left legible underneath, which is what the regulations require, and which is also, when you look at a page like that afterward, its own kind of monument. O'Hara's write-up was voided in 19 minutes. The bar notice was deleted by the same clerk who had processed it, who did not ask a single question and who told the story at least 50 times over the following year. At 10:00, Lieutenant Commander Amato asked Arsenault what she wanted done about the sworn statement, and he asked it carefully, because a knowingly false sworn statement is not a small thing, and both of them knew exactly what it could be made into. A young man's entire future was sitting on the desk between them, and Amato, who was a decent officer, was braced for the answer. Her answer was 4 words. Have him read it. So at 10:30 in the morning, in an empty wardroom, with 2 people present and a door closed, machinist's mate 2nd Class Trey Bonaventure read his own sworn statement aloud, and then he read the corpsman's report aloud, and then he read pages 1 through 7 of the Brow and Camel Man Overboard. Bill aloud, all 7 of them, including the paragraph about the first 30 seconds, and including page 5 about calling times out loud, so the record exists even when the people do not, and including page 7, which is the signature page. It took 35 minutes. It was the worst 5 of those minutes that he will ever spend. There was no punishment attached to it at all. Amato offered twice to muster the watch section on the pier, to do it properly, he said, meaning publicly, meaning the version of this story that everybody expects, and that would have made a very satisfying photograph. Arsenault declined both times. It happened, she said. Ensign Naidu saluted on a wet brow in front of 6 people at 0914. That was the right size for it. And that is the whole of it. There was no formation. There was no line of officers coming to attention. There was no announcement over the ship's system, and there was no photograph, and there was no story in the base paper. And the only reason anybody knows this happened at all is that a pier superintendent told it, and a seaman named Kit Fontaine told it, and a 19-year-old with 11 stitches in his hand told it for the rest of his life. Fontaine is the one who changed. He was the one who had laughed on the brow at 0501. At 1100 that morning, he came and found Ezra Battaglia at the pier shack and asked, awkwardly, badly, whether somebody could teach him the bill. Not sign it. Learn it. Battaglia started a qualification sheet that afternoon, with Fontaine's name first on it, and his own name in the instructor column, and underneath Fontaine's name, he wrote a second one. Bonaventure, T, MM2, pulled from the watch bill that morning, back into qualification, learning the 7 pages from a retired master diver, on a pier where the woman who wrote them would be his officer in charge for the next 2 years. He had to live under it. That was the entire consequence, and it was the correct one, and by the following spring, he was the best brow watch on that pier, and he was insufferable about the first 30 seconds, and every single person who stood a watch with him learned the bill whether they wanted to or not. That is the part of these stories that never makes the thumbnail, not the salute, the sheet of paper with 2 names on it. If you have ever been the one who was wrong and been given the chance to become useful instead of being made an example, take a second and subscribe to Honor Tales, because that is the ending this channel keeps coming back to. The response times on that pier were re-baselined the following week. Nobody announced why. At 12:40 in the afternoon, Wesley O'Hara came back down the pier. He had been discharged from the hospital at 11:45 with 11 stitches, a bandaged right hand, a wrapped shoulder, and instructions to rest. And he had gone directly to the pier instead, and he was refusing, in the mulish and immovable way of a 19-year-old, to go to the barracks until somebody found the Seabag. A yard diver brought it up at 12:40 from 22 feet of harbor mud, and it came over the side streaming brown water and weighing about 110 pounds. O'Hara carried it up the brow himself, one-handed, with his bandaged hand held up against his chest, and nobody offered to help him because everybody standing there could see exactly what he was doing. He set it down on the deck in front of Lieutenant Commander Delphine Arsenault and stood up and could not think of one single thing to say. "It's heavy, ma'am," he said. "It's dive gear." He nodded. He kept nodding. He was still nodding when she put a hand on his good shoulder for about a second and a half and then took it away. Then she went into the quarterdeck shack and signed the deck log, her first signature on that ship, at 12:44 in the afternoon, nearly 8 hours after she had walked up the brow with a bag on her shoulder. And under her signature, she printed her billet in block capitals, which nobody does, so that any sailor standing that watch at 3 in the morning for the next 2 years could look at the page and never have to guess. Her telephone had been face down in her pocket since 0400. There was one message on it, a photograph taken from a small boat at first light, a merchant hull lying over at 40 degrees, red bottom paint showing, containers stacked at an angle that nobody who has seen it ever quite forgets. Underneath the photograph, 4 words from a salvage master named Corvin Bloss, who had tended her line on a job in the Strait of Malacca in 2021, and who had never in 6 years sent her a message that was not about work. "Water's warm out here." She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she put the telephone in her pocket and went out onto the brow and stood there in the borrowed coveralls looking at 11 feet of ordinary harbor water between a hull and a timber camel, the same 11 feet that exist on every pier in the world, that 400 people walk over every morning without once looking down, and that had cost a 22-year-old named Aurelio Sant everything he was ever going to have. Behind her, Kit Fontaine was reading page 1 aloud to himself, badly, from a binder. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.